The Colonial Parkway Murders. There is a 23-mile stretch of road in Virginia built to showcase the birthplace of a nation. It winds through forests and marshland, connecting Jamestown, Williamsburg, and Yorktown, past overlooks designed for tourists to stop and take in the view. For 3 years in the 1980s, that same quiet, scenic road became something else entirely. A place where young couples went missing, and where one by one, their bodies were found. This is the story of the Colonial Parkway murders. And after nearly 40 years, part of that story has finally come to an end. The Colonial Parkway was completed in the 1950s, built by the National Park Service to link Virginia's historic triangle. It has almost none of the exits, gas stations, or businesses of a typical highway. Just trees, water, and a handful of secluded overlooks where visitors could pull off to enjoy the scenery. For local teenagers and young couples, those same overlooks quietly became known as places to park at night, away from prying eyes. That privacy would prove fatal. Between October 1986 and September 1989, 4 young couples disappeared from or near the parkway. 8 people in total. 4 of them were found murdered. 2 were never found at all. For decades, the case defied nearly every effort to solve it. Different jurisdictions, different methods of killing, and almost no physical evidence left behind. It became one of the most talked about unsolved cases in American true crime. Until, quite recently, it stopped being entirely unsolved. The first 2 victims were Kathleen Kathy Thomas and Rebecca Ann Dowski. Kathy was 27, a graduate of the United States Naval Academy. Rebecca was 21, a senior at the College of William and Mary. The 2 had been dating for several months. On the evening of October 9th, 1986, they were seen leaving a computer lab on campus. They were never seen alive again. 3 days later, on October 12th, a pedestrian noticed a car parked down an embankment along the parkway, mostly hidden from the road. A highway patrolman was called to investigate. Inside Kathy's white Honda Civic, he found both women dead. They had been bound with rope and strangled, their throats cut so deeply that the wounds nearly reached from ear to ear. Whoever killed them had also poured diesel fuel over the car and the bodies, apparently attempting to burn the evidence, an attempt that failed. There was no sign of sexual assault, which struck investigators as unusual for a crime of this brutality. Weeks later, FBI profilers began building a picture of who might be responsible. It would be the first of many profiles built and revised over the following decades, and the first of many false starts. Almost a year passed before the Parkway claimed its next victims. On September 19, 1987, 20-year-old David Knobling took his younger cousin and 14-year-old Robin Edwards to see a movie and spend time at an arcade. Robin snuck out of her house later that night to meet David again. The 2 drove across the James River Bridge to a secluded spot near the Ragged Island Wildlife Refuge, a marshy area not far from the parkway itself. They were never seen alive again either. David's pickup truck was found abandoned near the James River Bridge, the keys still in the ignition and the windshield wipers still running. 3 days later, on September 22nd, their bodies washed ashore near Ragged Island. Both had been shot execution style, Robin in the back of the head, David twice, once in the head and once in the shoulder, as though he had tried to run. The similarities to the Thomas and Dowski case were impossible to ignore, even though the method was completely different. Gunfire instead of strangulation in a blade. Investigators were now facing an unsettling possibility, that whoever was responsible didn't have a single consistent method, only a consistent hunting ground. 7 months later, in April 1988, 2 Christopher Newport University students went on their first date. Cassandra Lee Haley was 18. Richard Keith Call was 20. After attending a party together in Newport News, the 2 left around 1:30 in the morning. The next day, Keith's red Toyota Celica was found abandoned at the York River overlook along the Colonial Parkway, less than 2 miles from where Kathy Thomas and Rebecca Dowski had been found nearly 2 years earlier. Almost all of their clothing was still inside the car, along with Keith's wallet and Cassandra's purse, ruling out robbery. Search dogs traced their scent to the water's edge and lost it there. Despite extensive searching, neither Cassandra nor Keith was ever found. To this day, theirs remains the only case in the series where no bodies were ever recovered. By this point, the public and the press had given the killings a name: the Colonial Parkway Murders. A $10,000 reward was offered for information. It brought in tips, theories, and false leads, but no arrests. The pattern, grim as it was, seemed to define itself around young couples parked in secluded areas near the parkway. But investigators would later connect at least 2 more victims to the same period, and eventually, the same killer. Cases that didn't initially fit the couple in a car pattern at all. In December 1987, a heavy equipment operator named Brian Craig Pettinger vanished after a ballroom dance class in Hampton. His body was found weeks later in a marshy area of the James River, his wrists and ankles bound. In March 1988, 18-year-old Lori Ann Powell disappeared while walking home in Gloucester County. Her body was later recovered from the James River as well. And in July 1989, 29-year-old Teresa Lynn Howell was seen leaving a Hampton nightclub called the Zodiac Club at roughly 2:30 in the morning. Hours later, a construction crew found her body in a nearby wooded area. She had been sexually assaulted and strangled. For years, these cases were treated as separate from the core Colonial Parkway killings, since none of the victims were young couples parked along the parkway itself. That distinction would later prove to be far less meaningful than investigators once believed. The final chapter of the original series unfolded over Labor Day weekend, 1989. 21-year-old Daniel Lauer was driving his girlfriend's sister-in-law, 18-year-old Anna Maria Phelps, to Virginia Beach to help his brother and Anna Maria's boyfriend with money troubles. Daniel's gold 1972 Chevrolet Nova was later found abandoned at a rest stop along Interstate 64 on what appeared to be the wrong route for where they were supposedly headed. More than a month later, on October 19th, hunters found their remains wrapped in a blanket off a logging road, roughly a mile from where the car had been discovered. The bodies were too decomposed for investigators to determine an exact cause of death, though Anna Maria's remains showed what appeared to be knife marks. Daniel had reportedly been carrying several $100s in cash from summer work, raising the possibility that robbery, rather than a targeted attack on a couple, may have been the motive, the detail that set this case apart from the others in ways investigators still debate. With Daniel and Anna Maria's deaths, the killings that had haunted the Colonial Parkway for 3 years simply stopped. No further disappearances or murders were ever linked to the same pattern. Whether the person responsible moved away, was imprisoned for an unrelated crime, or died, no one could say for certain. For more than 3 decades, the investigation into these cases was defined by frustration. The murders spanned multiple jurisdictions: the National Park Service, the Virginia State Police, the FBI, and local police departments in several counties, each initially treating the incidents as unconnected. Evidence handling in the earliest case was later criticized, with park rangers entering the crime scene and removing items before state or federal investigators arrived. By the time authorities recognized a pattern, crucial time and potentially crucial evidence had already been lost. Suspects came and went over the years. A local private investigator named Ronald Little drew scrutiny after it emerged that several victims had connections to his security company. He was later deported to his native New Zealand on unrelated immigration charges and died some years afterward, having never been charged in the killings. Speculation even touched on whether the killer might have posed as, or actually been, a member of law enforcement, a theory fueled partly by an FBI profiler's private remarks to one victim's brother, and partly by a rolled-down driver's window in one crime scene that suggested the victims may have willingly stopped for someone they didn't see as a threat. For decades, none of it led anywhere. The case went cold enough that hope of ever solving it seemed to fade along with the physical evidence itself. Then, Beginning in January 2024, everything changed. Using advances in forensic DNA analysis and genetic genealogy, Virginia State Police and the FBI announced they had positively linked a man named Alan Wade Wilmer Sr. to the 1987 murders of David Knobling and Robin Edwards, as well as the 1989 murder of Teresa Lynn Howell. Wilmer had been a local waterman, working his own boat to harvest clams and oysters along Virginia's rivers. He had actually been questioned decades earlier and had passed a polygraph test at the time, clearing him, in the eyes of investigators, of involvement in the Call and Haley disappearance. He had died in 2017 at the age of 63, never knowing, or perhaps never fearing, that DNA technology would eventually catch up to him. The following year, in 2025, investigators announced a further connection. Wilmer was also linked to the 1988 murder of Lori Ann Powell. And in January 2026, the FBI's Norfolk field office confirmed the case authorities had spent nearly 40 years chasing, that Wilmer was also responsible for the deaths of Kathy Thomas and Rebecca Dowski, the very first victims found back in 1986. For Kathy's brother, Bill Thomas, the news arrived after decades of following false leads and dead ends. Investigators, he later said, had questioned roughly 150 different persons of interest over the years, and Wilmer's name still came as a genuine surprise, despite having crossed investigators' radar from nearly the very beginning. With those confirmations, Wilmer stands connected to at least 6 of the 8 known Colonial Parkway. 2 cases remain unresolved by DNA. The disappearance of Keith Call and Cassandra Haley, the only victims never found at all, has not been officially confirmed to Wilmer, though some family members say they've been told a connection exists. And the deaths of Daniel Lauer and Anna Maria Phelps, marked by a different apparent motive and a body left far differently than the others, may point to an entirely separate killer altogether. Nearly 40 years after Kathy Thomas and Rebecca Dowski were found in a car along the Colonial Parkway, most of their case and several others once thought unconnected finally have an answer. Alan Wade Wilmer Sr. died believing, perhaps, that his crimes would remain buried along the same riverbanks where he built his living. Advances in DNA science proved otherwise. But not every question along the Colonial Parkway has been answered. Cassandra Haley and Keith Call have still never been found. And whether the same hands responsible for 6 confirmed deaths were also responsible for the deaths of Daniel Lauer and Anna Maria Phelps remains, for now, unresolved. The road itself still runs exactly as it always has, quiet, scenic, lined with the same overlooks where once, for 3 unexplained years, going parking with someone you loved could cost you your life. For most of the families who waited decades for an answer, that wait is finally over. For a few, it isn't yet.